Hello, I'm Judi Tarowsky, storyteller and a member of the West Virginia Storytelling Guild. I'm going to tell you the story of the Wampus Cat. And this story comes from Mack Samples' book, The Devil's Tea Tables. And Mack has very, very kindly given me permission to tell stories from his book, The Wampus Cat. The Elk River flows into the Kanawha River at Charleston, West Virginia. And many, many years ago, folks traveled up the Elk River Valley to find a good place to homestead, to establish a farm. And Mr. and Mrs. Hewitt were such a couple. They traveled up the Elk until they came to a place where two creeks flowed into the Elk. And there was a shoals between those two creeks, and it was called King Shoals. And Mr. Hewitt decided that the bottomland above those two shoals would make a perfect place to farm. So he built a cabin for himself and his wife. Several years later, Mrs. Hewitt had a son. And a few years after that, she had another son. And the boys grew up strong and helpful to their father. And they had a good life there on the farm. But it wasn't until 10 years later that Mrs. Hewitt gave birth to a daughter. Now, Mr. Hewitt loved his sons dearly, but he absolutely doted on his baby girl. Many times in the evening when Mrs. Hewitt would be helping the boys get ready for bed, Hewitt would sit with her in the rocking chair in front of the fire, and he would sing to her and talk to her. And he would tell her, Papa's going to take very good care of you. And Papa's not going to let anything bad happen to you. And when he breathed in her sweet baby scent, he thought his heart would burst. Sadly, though, several months later, the child fell ill. She began running a very high fever, and Mr. and Mrs. Hewitt tried everything they knew to bring that fever down. They tried an onion poultice on her chest. It was an old remedy. They tried even cooling baths, but nothing worked. And finally, Hewitt decided that he needed to go down to Charleston to find a doctor who'd be willing to come up the Elk to help their child. Hewitt didn't have a saddle horse. He had a draft horse. He didn't even have a saddle, so he threw an old blanket over the horse's back, and he fashioned a bridle to put on the horse, and he mounted that old draft horse and headed down toward Charleston. It took him 3 days to get there. And it took him another 3 days before he could find a doctor who'd be willing to make that trip up the Elk. The doctor had a fine saddle horse, which was quite a contrast between the draft horse that Hewitt was riding. It took them another 3 days to make it back to the Hewitt farm. But when they arrived, they were too late. The little girl had died. The doctor examined her and determined that what had killed her was scarlet fever, and he said that really wasn't anything he could have done. And when he left, Hewitt wanted to pay him, but the doctor refused. He says, no, I really didn't do anything. You owe me nothing. So the Hewitts buried their little girl up on the hill above the farm. And Hewitt was so grief-stricken. He took to his bed. He could not get up to work. And fortunately, the boys were big enough and strong enough. They kept the farm going until finally Hewitt was able to get out of bed and go back to work. One night, he and his wife were standing out on the porch of their home, just listening to the sounds in the trees from the insects and the birds, when down from the hill, up near where their daughter was buried, there came a terrible shriek, a cry. Now, most people would say that was a panther. And it's true that the cry of a panther would absolutely chill your blood, but no. This cry sent a cold blade of fear right into your soul. And Hewitt heard it, and Hewitt knew what it was, but he dared not speak it. So he and his wife went to bed. And shortly after they went to bed came that terrible cry again from down off the hill. So the next night, Hewitt determined to go up on the hill and find what was defiling his child's grave. So he took his dogs and his rifle and went up on the hill before sunset and settled in there on the hill to wait. Of course, darkness fell, but nothing happened. There was no cry. So Hewitt went back down to home and went to bed. He'd been maybe asleep for about 5 minutes when that cry, that shriek, came down the hill again. The next night, Hewitt got his gun and his dogs, and this time he went up the hill after sunset. Went up and settled down in the darkness to wait. Before long, his dogs began calling and barking, and they were treeing something in a nearby tree. They were surrounding the tree and barking and howling. Hewitt went over with his rifle and looked up into the branches. He could see movement up there, but he couldn't make out exactly what it was. But the dogs kept up their cries. So he raised his rifle and fired up into the branches. Whatever it was fell heavily down through the branches to the ground, and Hewitt had to grab a stick to keep the dogs away before they could tear it to pieces. Hewitt still couldn't see what he'd shot, but he grabbed a leg and dragged it down the hill, took it into the smokehouse, which was some distance from the barn, lifted it up onto the table in the smokehouse and lit his lantern to see what the creature was. And what he saw was the body of a panther. But this creature had the face of a woman. Bile rose in his throat, sour and hot, and he bent over and spit it out on the floor. For yes, he knew what it was. Now he could speak it. It was a Wampus cat. And many people in West Virginia at that time and in other places of Appalachia believed that a Wampus cat was the manifestation of a person who had died and who believed they had been wronged in death and would come back as the Wampus cat to torment the person who had wronged them. Hewitt wiped his mouth on his sleeve. Then he took a rope and lashed it around the hind feet of the creature. And he threw the other end of the rope up over the rafters in the smokehouse and hauled it to hang upside down there. He would deal with it in the morning. Hewitt made his way back to the house, and the boys heard the gunshot, and they were out on the porch yelling, "Papa, Papa, what did you shoot? We heard the gun. What is it? Can we go see?" He said, "Boys, go back to bed. It'll keep until light." Hewitt went back to bed, settled into a deep, deep sleep. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, every animal in the barn was shrieking and crying and baying. And Hewitt jumped out of bed. He thought for sure the barn was on fire, and he ran to his window and looked out. But it was the smokehouse that was on fire. And it was far enough away from the barn. It had been put there for that reason that he didn't really worry about it. He went back to bed and fell into another deep sleep. The next morning, Hewitt went down to the smokehouse, the remains of it anyway, and all that was left there were some ashes and the stench of burned flesh and hair. He shoveled up the ashes and took them down to the midden where they threw all their trash. Well, life returned to what could be normal for them, for the Hewitts. But that Wampus cat haunted Hewitt for the rest of his days. It haunted him with the thought that he had not done enough to save his baby daughter, and that she had come back to tell him so. Thank you for the listen.